The United Kingdom's envoy to the United Nations says she does not believe the resolution that created a no-fly zone in Libya in 2011 was a mistake.
Ambassador Karen Pierce sat down exclusively with SABC News in New York to discuss her recent participation at a seminar hosted by the Department of International Relations in Pretoria. But the conversation later turned to developments in Libya, where a rebel commander in the country's east is now heading an offensive attack against the internationally recognized government in the capital, Tripoli, leading to fears of a return to a full-blown conflict just days ahead of a UN-brokered peace conference in April the 14th.
She's returned to New York after a whirlwind visit to South Africa last week, where she addressed a DIRCO seminar on the relevance of the Security Council in the current global climate.
The most important thing to remember about the Security Council is that although people resent the veto to a certain extent, although the veto stops us making progress on issues like Syria, it is nevertheless the price of the UN Security Council and the UN continuing in existence. I think the way round that, as it were, is to make sure that where some issues can be dealt with in the Security Council, and I'd say Yemen has been a good example of Security Council unity, that we maximise that unity to the full.
We pressed her on whether the veto was not simply and fundamentally unfair.
I don't think it's fundamentally unfair in the sense of it was the price of the permanent 5 members agreeing to the Security Council and the UN back in 1945. Do we think there should be self-imposed restraint on use of the veto? Yes, we as the United Kingdom do. We have signed up to the General Assembly Act initiative, and there's also the French initiative on not using the veto in cases of genocide. It's quite interesting that most of the time the veto is used, it is used by countries not in their direct national security interest, but often to protect wider strategic interests, as you have seen with the US and Israel relationship, as we see now, something like 12 vetoes since 2018 on the Russians protecting President Assad in Syria.
The UK envoy indicated that the two countries would work closely on issues of women, peace and security and women's mediation as a growing pillar of post-conflict resolution and peace building.
Ambassador, what has your experience been of South Africa's tenure on the Council to date? They've been there now for 4 months. And what are some of the issues where Pretoria can be most useful from a UK perspective?
I think although South Africa and Britain sometimes come at issues from a different perspective, the one thing we have in common is that we both care very deeply about multilateralism, and we both care about doing what we can to support the rules-based international system, which on the whole has kept the world safe and prosperous since 1945. So it's about finding ways we can cooperate within that framework and bearing in mind we have the same goal, we sometimes have different routes towards it.
Turning to Libya, the UN has called for a humanitarian pause to fighting as clashes between a renegade commander, General Khalifa Haftar, and militias loyal to Libya's internationally recognized government threaten to return the country to a full-blown conflict.
So the Secretary General was in Libya on the ground when these developments started unfolding. And just days, basically a week before the UN-brokered peace conference in Libya was due to take place. What is your understanding from your perspective, Ambassador, of why General Haftar is doing this now?
I'm looking at this second or third hand, as it were. In my experience, which might be wrong in this case, but in my experience, when military people make these decisions, they make them because they see an opportunity, and they set aside the diplomatic track for that moment. I can't say if that's what's happened with General Haftar. It might be. I think it's important that the Security Council back the Secretary General.
A UN-brokered national conference is due to start on April 14th and for now appears to be moving ahead.
I think it will depend on whether General Haftar does cease his advance. It can go ahead in the sense that the Special Representative Hassan Salameh has said he wants it to go ahead. It would clearly be better for Libya and the Libyan people if we can get that conference, which is a key plank of the political settlement, if we can get that conference underway. But as we've just been saying, the situation on the ground is fluid and it risks being very dangerous. So again, I don't want to commit until we see how things unfold.
Developments that have again raised questions about the international community's role in the North African country.
What are some of the lessons one should learn as a Security Council from the intervention in Libya in 2011, Resolution 1973, creating a no-fly zone to protect civilians, NATO airstrikes that allowed for the killing and ouster of Muammar Gaddafi? Are there lessons that the Council has learned from that intervention? And it begs the question if that wasn't a mistake.
No, I don't think that resolution was a mistake because, as I say, it was a response to a particular set of circumstances around an imminent humanitarian catastrophe. There are always lessons to be learned from each conflict and each intervention, whether they ultimately end as expected or not. I think the point to make about 2011 in Libya is that the intervention was done with the most altruistic of motives. It was to prevent an overwhelming humanitarian catastrophe developing around Benghazi. Now, clearly, that did not later pan out as expected or even as foreseen. So obviously, we have to learn a lot from the way things developed and our own inability to forecast what might happen and put in place measures that might enable us to deal with that effectively. So yes, we have to learn lessons from these things. But the point I would like to stress is that standing by and doing nothing in the face of an overwhelming humanitarian catastrophe is not a good option either.
And as clashes rage near the capital, Tripoli, conversations continue on how best the Security Council might assist the Secretary-General's attempt to secure a temporary ceasefire in Libya. Sherwin Bryceby's SABC News, New York.